Everyone thinks Hoover Dam's problem is that Lake Mead is drying up. It isn't. The real threshold is one number, 1,035 feet. Below that elevation, 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines have to shut down, not because the dam is failing, but because running them any lower risks tearing them apart internally. That single shutdown collapses the dam's output from roughly 1,300 megawatts down to 382. And here's what nobody's saying. The backup turbines built specifically for this exact scenario, one of them is already sitting offline with no repair date publicly announced. I work with reservoir and power systems, and I'm going to tell you why that headline about Lake Mead drying up is doing you a disservice. It's not wrong, exactly. It's just aimed at the wrong villain. The lake losing water is the weather story. What I'm about to walk you through is the engineering story. And engineering stories don't get less scary once you understand them. They get more scary, because weather is unpredictable. This wasn't. Let's start with the number, because everybody keeps talking about Lake Mead like it's a bathtub that's just draining, and total volume isn't actually what matters here. What matters is elevation, height, the distance between the surface of the water and the turbine sitting at the base of the dam. That's called hydraulic head, and it's the entire reason Hoover Dam can make electricity at all. Water falling from height builds pressure. Pressure spins turbines. Turbines make power. No fall, no pressure, no power. So when the lake drops, it's not losing water in some abstract sense that matters to a spreadsheet. It's losing the exact thing the whole power plant depends on: distance. Picture it physically for a second, because this is not an abstract concept. It's a literal wall of water pressing down through intake towers toward the powerhouse at the base of the dam. When that reservoir is full, the water column stacked above the turbines is enormous, and that weight is what does the work. As Lake Mead drops, you can watch it happen on the canyon walls themselves. There's a pale ring left behind on the rock where the water used to sit. Sometimes people call it the bathtub ring. And every foot of exposed rock in that ring is a foot of lost pressure at the bottom of the dam. That's not decoration. That ring is basically a public gauge of how much power generating capacity has already walked away. And there's a specific distance on that gauge where things break: 1,035 feet above sea level. Below that line, 12 of the dam's 17 turbines are not rated to keep running. Not because someone forgot to maintain them, because they were built decades ago for a certain pressure range, and asking them to spin at pressures below that range risks a problem called cavitation. Basically, low pressure pockets forming and collapsing inside the turbine fast enough to physically erode the metal from the inside. You do that long enough, you're not looking at a maintenance bill. You're looking at destroyed equipment. So the agency that runs Hoover Dam, the Bureau of Reclamation, has to shut those 12 turbines down before that happens. That's not a failure in the moment. That's a decision to protect the equipment by turning most of the plant off. Here's the part that should actually bother you. Reclamation has known this threshold was coming for at least a year and a half. This wasn't a surprise announcement. This was a slow motion approach to a line they'd already drawn on a map. Water managers were watching the elevation number the way you'd watch a fuel gauge on a long drive with no gas stations left. They knew where empty was. They knew roughly when they'd hit it. And when the moment finally arrived in the headlines this year, it got covered like a shock. It wasn't a shock. It was a scheduled appointment nobody wanted to talk about out loud until it showed up on the calendar for real. So, let's talk about what showing up actually costs. At full pool, when Lake Mead is completely topped off, Hoover Dam can generate about 2,080 megawatts. That's a big power plant, comparable to a large coal or nuclear facility. In recent years, with the lake already depleted, that number was down to somewhere around 1,300 megawatts. Bad, but survivable. Once you cross below the 1,035-foot line, and those 12 older turbines have to come offline, the number falls to 382 megawatts. Read that gap again, 1,300 to 382. That's not a dip. That's losing roughly 70% of what the dam can produce, almost overnight, on the calendar, at a predetermined elevation everyone in the industry has been staring at for a year and a half. Now, I want to be fair here, because there's a fix, and it's a real one. It's not fake technology. There's a category of turbine called a wide head turbine, engineered specifically to keep functioning at lower pressures, down to around 950 feet of elevation instead of failing at 1,035. Hoover Dam already has 5 of them. They were installed roughly a decade before this crisis at a cost of around $42 million. And they were built for exactly one reason: because reclamation had already been through a version of this problem before. Let that sink in for a second. This is not Hoover Dam's first low water turbine crisis. It's the second one. The first low water crisis is literally why 5 of the turbines currently in that powerhouse exist at all. So if you're the agency running this dam, and you already lived through this exact scenario once, and you already built a fix for it once, you'd think the next round would feel like a well-rehearsed drill. Swap in more wide head units, keep the lights on, move on. That's the story I expected to find. It is not the story I found. Here's the detail that made me stop and reread the reporting twice. As of the most recent public information, one of those 5 existing wide head turbines, the unit specifically engineered to survive this exact low water scenario, is currently offline, not scheduled for maintenance next quarter. Offline, with reclamation giving no public timeline for when it comes back. So the backup system built for this specific emergency is short-staffed during the emergency it was built for. I don't know how else to describe that except as the least reassuring sentence in the entire situation, and it barely makes the news coverage. Everyone's writing about the lake shrinking. Almost nobody is writing that one of the 5 units meant to survive a shrinking lake isn't currently running. Let's actually sit inside that turbine hall for a second, because the physical picture matters more than the number does. Picture the powerhouse at the base of the dam, rows of massive turbine generator units lined up in sequence, each one connected up through a penstock, a giant steel pipe, to the intake towers rising out of the lake above. Under normal conditions, that whole chain is just physics doing its job quietly. Water falling, spinning a shaft, nobody thinking about it. The 12 older units in that hall were designed decades ago, when nobody planned for Lake Mead to sit anywhere near 950 feet, let alone flirt with going lower. Asking a machine built for one pressure world to keep running in a completely different one isn't a small ask. It's asking metal components to absorb stress they were never engineered to tolerate, over and over, thousands of cycles a day, until something inside starts pitting and failing. Cavitation damage doesn't announce itself with a bang. It's slow, it's internal, and by the time it's visible from the outside, you've usually already lost the turbine. Okay, so what's reclamation actually doing about all this? In late May, the Bureau of Reclamation announced it would spend about $52 million on infrastructure, operations, and maintenance at Hoover Dam, with a big piece of that going toward replacing up to 3 of the older, vulnerable turbines with new wide head units. Officials framed this publicly as a reassuring, forward-looking investment in the dam's long-term reliability, and I'll give them credit. That's a fair thing to want people to hear, and nobody was lying. And on paper, restoring somewhere around 160 megawatts sounds like good news. It is good news. I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's fake, or that nobody's trying to fix this. People are trying to fix this. My problem is with the math, and with where the money's coming from. But there's a difference between a statement being true and a statement being complete. Reassuring language about long-term reliability is the kind of thing that sounds like an answer while quietly skipping the 2 questions that actually matter. How much of the underlying vulnerability does this fix, and on what schedule? Diplomatic framing is not the same as a timeline. It just wears a timeline's clothes. 3 new turbines, 12 vulnerable ones, and one of the 5 existing fixes already sidelined. Do that arithmetic slowly. Even after this new investment lands, assuming it lands without delay, you are nowhere close to turbine parity with the number of units that can't safely run in low water. You've patched a hole in a hole. That's not me being cynical for the sake of it. That's just counting. 3 replacing part of 12, while one of the 5 you already had is down. Say that number combination out loud and tell me it sounds like a solved problem. And then there's the money itself, which is the part that made me raise an eyebrow the most. The $52 million isn't new congressional funding pulled out of thin air for this crisis. It's coming out of something called the Hoover Dam Post-Retirement Benefit Fund, a pool of money that was originally set aside to cover pension obligations for Hoover employees. Reclamation's position is that the fund is no longer needed for that pension purpose, so it can be redirected toward operations and maintenance instead. Maybe that's completely fine, administratively. I'm not accusing anyone of doing anything improper with it. But when the fix for a known, telegraphed for a decade and a half engineering problem is being funded out of a repurposed retirement account instead of a dedicated capital plan, that tells you something about how this got prioritized on the way in. It tells you the money was found, not budgeted. Those are two very different postures for an agency to be operating from, and only one of them looks like a plan. And it's worth knowing that repurposing the pension fund wasn't Reclamation just improvising on its own. Power industry trade groups had been pushing Congress to pass legislation, sometimes referred to as the Hoover Dam Act, specifically to unlock those retirement fund dollars for dam upgrades, arguing the pension obligations were already covered through other means. So the funding mechanism itself was a lobbying outcome as much as an engineering decision. That doesn't make it wrong. It just means the money trail runs through Washington politics before it ever reaches a turbine. And here's the piece that's genuinely frustrating if you are hoping for a clean answer. Nobody knows when the new turbines will actually be installed. There's no completion date attached to the announcement. Reporters asked Reclamation's press office directly about the installation timeline. They didn't respond. So you've got a known threshold, a known equipment vulnerability, a partially disabled backup system, a funding source pulled from an unrelated account, and an undefined finish line for the actual repair. That's not a conspiracy. I want to be precise about that. Nobody's hiding a body here. But that combination of facts is exactly what a monitoring and accountability gap looks like from the inside. And it's the kind of gap that makes confident public statements sound a lot less confident once you line the dates up next to each other. A well-run system doesn't just tell you the fix is coming. It tells you when, and it tells you what happens to demand and pricing in the meantime. Silence on that timeline isn't neutral. Silence is itself a data point. Now, before you assume this is purely a drought story, I need to add one more layer, because it changes who's actually responsible for the timing of this. Lake Mead's decline this year isn't only rainfall and snowpack. In April, Reclamation made a deliberate decision to cut water releases out of Lake Powell, upstream at Glen Canyon Dam, by about 20%. That wasn't an accident of nature. That was a management choice, made to protect Glen Canyon's own infrastructure and keep water able to flow through that system at all. Less water released from Powell means less water arriving downstream into Mead. So part of the reason Hoover is staring down this threshold right now, on this particular timeline, is a triage decision made at a completely different dam to protect a completely different piece of infrastructure. The two reservoirs are connected by the same river and, functionally, by the same crisis. When you hear drought, you're hearing half the story. The other half is a chain of human decisions made upstream, each one reasonable in isolation, that compound into exactly the outcome everyone claims to be surprised about downstream. I want to slow down on that for a second because it's the kind of detail that sounds boring in a press release and isn't boring at all once you understand what it actually does. A 20% cut in releases from one reservoir doesn't stay contained to that reservoir. Rivers are systems, not isolated tanks. Every decision at Powell shows up, delayed but inevitable, at Mead. So when officials talk about Hoover's power problem like it's a standalone weather event, they're leaving out that a decision made somewhere else to protect something else is actively accelerating the very tripwire we've been talking about this whole time. That's not corruption. It's just interconnected infrastructure being described as if it isn't. Let's talk about what this actually means for people, because megawatts and elevation numbers are abstract until you translate them. Hoover's hydropower is valuable specifically because it's cheap and it's fast. It can ramp up and down within the hour to match demand across Nevada, California, and Arizona, which is exactly what the grid needs during peak stress, like a heat wave in August when everyone's air conditioning kicks on at once. When that capacity drops by 70%, utilities don't just shrug. They have to replace that power with something else, usually natural gas peaking plants, which are more expensive to run and slower to respond. That cost doesn't evaporate. It moves down the chain to ratepayers across 3 states. Fishing guides who work the lake, marina operators, tourists who show up expecting to see a full reservoir and instead find a bathtub ring taller than a building, none of them are the ones deciding turbine replacement schedules, but all of them are downstream of that decision in one way or another, whether it's water access, boat ramps closing at low elevation, or the regional power price that eventually lands in a utility bill. So this isn't an abstract dam story. It's a bill that shows up later, quietly, on people's electricity statements, for a mechanical failure that was documented 18 months in advance and funded out of a pension account with no installation date attached. Think about who actually absorbs that gap in the meantime. It's not the agency issuing the press release. It's the utility that has to source replacement power on short notice. And it's the household that gets the invoice for that replacement power a few billing cycles later without ever being told why the number moved. Nobody's going to write turbine cavitation threshold on your electric bill, but that's functionally what you'd be paying for. I keep coming back to the same question, and it's the question I ask every time I look at a system that finally breaks in a way everyone claims not to have seen coming. What would a genuinely proactive plan have looked like here? Because it's not this. A proactive plan doesn't wait until the elevation gauge is approaching the tripwire to scramble for turbines. A proactive plan doesn't build 5 replacement units a decade ago, watch the same trajectory continue, and then treat the next round as an emergency fund drawn from a repurposed pension account instead of dedicated capital. If you already know the shape of the curve because you've been down this exact road once before, sizing the fix for the last crisis instead of the one you can already see coming isn't bad luck. It's under forecasting a problem you had better information about than almost anyone. To be fair, none of this means the wide head turbines are the wrong technology. They're not. This isn't a case where someone bought the wrong tool for the job entirely, like dropping an oxidizer meant for still water into a river with heavy flow. The technology is legitimate, tested, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do at lower reservoir elevations. The mismatch here isn't chemistry to site or technology to problem, it's pace to trajectory. You can have exactly the right solution and still lose the race if you keep buying it 3 units at a time against a problem that's 12 units deep and getting worse every dry year. That's the quieter kind of failure, and it's harder to put in a headline than wrong technology, but it's the one that's actually happening here. I also want to sit with that offline wide head turbine for one more second, because it's the detail that keeps nagging at me. This is a unit that exists specifically because reclamation already learned this lesson once. It survived the design phase, the decade-old budget fight, the installation, and presumably years of normal operation. And at the exact moment its entire reason for existing becomes relevant again, it's down, with the public given no window into when that changes. If you're building redundancy into a critical system specifically to survive a known failure mode, and one piece of that redundancy is unavailable during the failure mode it was designed for, that's not a footnote. That's the sentence that should be in the headline instead of the lake level number. And this is where I'd start asking the annoying questions, the ones a competent independent audit would ask before another dollar moves. What's actually wrong with that offline unit, and is it related to age, load, or the same low pressure stress the other turbines are trying to avoid? Was there a maintenance plan for the existing 5 wide head turbines at all? Or were they installed a decade ago and then largely left alone until something failed? Is the new $52 million enough to also harden the fleet you already have? Or does it only cover the 3 new installs while the 5th existing unit sits there unaddressed? None of those questions have public answers right now. That's not proof of mismanagement. It's proof of a monitoring gap, and monitoring gaps are exactly where confident public statements go to get quietly contradicted later. Here's what a professional capacity plan actually looks like, for comparison, because it's worth naming what didn't happen here. It starts with a published maintenance schedule for existing critical redundancy, not just for the 12 vulnerable turbines, but for the 5 that were already supposed to be the answer. It includes a funded, multi-year replacement pipeline tied to the elevation trend line, not a single announcement that shows up once the threshold is already closed. It includes a public dashboard, or at least a clear public statement, on what capacity is available right now, this month, not a projection buried in a technical filing. And it includes a completion date attached to every dollar spent, because a fix without a date isn't a fix, it's an intention. None of that is exotic. Utilities and reservoir operators build plans like that all the time. The absence of one here, after 18 months of advance warning, and a repeat performance of a problem the agency already solved once, is the actual story. So where does this actually leave things? Lake Mead was recently reported at roughly 31% full, sitting near record low levels. The line at 1,035 feet isn't moving. It's the same number it's always been, because it's tied to physical equipment, not to public sentiment or press timing. The upstream releases out of Lake Powell are still constrained. The math on turbine replacement still doesn't balance. 3 new units against 12 vulnerable ones and 1 already disabled backup. And the completion date for the fix still doesn't exist in any public document I could find. None of that means Hoover Dam is about to go dark. It means the story people are telling, the one about a lake quietly disappearing while officials scramble heroically to save it, is the comfortable version. The uncomfortable version is that this was forecast, documented, and repeated, and the response has been reactive retrofits sized to the last emergency instead of a capacity plan sized to the trajectory everyone in the room already understood. That's not a weather problem. That's a planning problem, wearing a weather costume. And the weather costume is a lot easier for a headline to sell than the planning problem underneath it. I'm not telling you to panic about your lights going out next summer. I'm telling you to stop being surprised every time one of these thresholds gets crossed, because the surprise is doing a lot of work to hide how predictable this actually was. The elevation gauge doesn't care about press releases, and it never has. If you want the one image to actually remember from all of this, don't picture a shrinking lake. Picture the number itself, 1,035 feet, sitting on a chart somewhere in an agency office for a year and a half before it ever made it into a headline, while nobody outside that office was watching it the way they should have been. The lake didn't surprise anyone. The number was never a secret. It just wasn't loud enough to matter until the day it finally arrived. And by then, the fix was already running behind the problem.